They thought it would be just another day on Capitol Hill. Another debate. Another political show. Another moment that would be forgotten in the endless cycle of Washington drama. But no one was prepared for what was about to unfold. Chamber, in front of flashing cameras and restless lawmakers. A decades-old voice echoed through the speakers, a voice that belonged to none other than Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Her old speech, sharp and unyielding, was suddenly brought back to life. And it wasn't played as tribute. No, it was played as a weapon, a trap. A carefully orchestrated attempt to corner Representative Jasmine Crockett and silence her with the authority of a legend. The air in the room shifted the moment the first words rang out. Lawmakers leaned forward. Reporters scribbled furiously. Some smirked, as if already anticipating Crockett's stumble. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone had dug through the archives, pulled out one of Ginsburg's most forceful addresses, and dropped it into the middle of this hearing like a thunderbolt. And why? To remind Crockett of her place. To warn her that no matter how fiery she might be, she could never measure up to an icon like RBG. At least, that was the plan. The camera zoomed in on Crockett. She sat still at first, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. Could almost hear the whispers around the chamber. Will she crack? Will she stumble? She tried to dodge the question. The lawmakers who engineered this moment thought they had her boxed in. They thought the weight of Ginsburg's legacy would press down so hard that Crockett would buckle under the pressure. After all, who dares to counter the words of Ruth Bader Ginsburg? But here's the thing. Sometimes when you try to corner someone, you only set the stage for their breakout moment. Jasmine Crockett was about to prove that in a way no one saw coming. The clip of Ginsburg's voice played on, powerful, commanding. It was about the balance of power, about the role of women in leadership, about the need for strength and restraint, all at once. Every sentence carried the weight of history. By the time it ended, the room was heavy with expectation. All eyes turned to Crockett. The silence was suffocating. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to vanish. Then came the setup, the question. A senior lawmaker leaned forward, his tone dripping with condescension. Representative Crockett, he began. After hearing the words of the great Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, do you still hold the same reckless positions you've been pushing here today? Or will you admit that you've been out of line? There, it was, the trap sprung. The challenge laid bare. Crockett looked at him, calm, steady, like someone who had been here before. But make no mistake, this wasn't just another exchange. This was a defining moment. Cameras were rolling. Clips would be replayed millions of times within hours. One wrong word, and she'd be branded forever as the young lawmaker who dared to disrespect a legend. The senior lawmaker smirked, convinced he had her. Other members chuckled under their breath. But Crockett didn't move yet. She let the silence stretch. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. Long enough for the tension to twist like a knife in the room. She leaned back, took a slow breath, and then leaned forward, her eyes locking on her challenger. Everyone expected hesitation. Everyone expected a clumsy attempt to wiggle out. What they got instead was something no one saw coming. But that reply wouldn't just answer the challenge. It would blow the doors off the entire debate and send shockwaves far beyond that chamber. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to play defense. She was about to flip the script. The trap had been set long before that hearing even began. Behind closed doors, strategists whispered, lawmakers plotted, and staffers rehearsed every angle. They didn't just pull out Ginsburg's old speech at random. No, this was carefully chosen, cherry-picked from hours of her most forceful moments. They wanted words that would sting. Words that would box Jasmine Crockett into a corner so tight she would have no room to breathe. To them, it was the perfect weapon, the unimpeachable voice of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Used as a ghost from the past to crush the fire of the present, you could see the smug confidence painted across the faces of her opponents as that recording ended. They believed they had orchestrated a masterstroke. After all, who in their right mind would dare challenge the authority of a Supreme Court legend? For them, it wasn't just a political tactic. was a trap designed to humiliate, to make her appear small, reckless, and naive against the towering reputation of RBG. And let's not pretend they didn't have an audience in mind. The chamber itself was one thing, but the real battleground was the internet. They knew the cameras were rolling. They knew clips would be chopped, shared, and blasted across social media within minutes. The plan was simple. Jasmine Crockett would be exposed. Her fiery brand of politics extinguished by the ghost of a woman who defined an era of law and justice. It was a stage-managed spectacle, a performance meant to destroy her credibility, as one of the senior members leaned back, in his chair, folding his arms with that self-satisfied grin. You could almost hear his unspoken words, "Checkmate." But here's the problem with traps. They only work if the prey doesn't see them coming. And Crockett wasn't blind. She'd spent her entire career navigating hostile waters, courtrooms where no one wanted her voice heard, committees where her questions were brushed aside. She had learned the hard way that politics isn't about playing nice. It's about surviving fire with fire and knowing when to flip the game. Across the room, a commentator analyst whispered to a colleague, "They're walking her right into it." "Watch, she's not going to back down," but the colleague shook his head, convinced otherwise. You don't stand toe-to-toe with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legacy. That's suicide. The stage was perfectly set. On one side, the weight of history, a legend's words echoing like scripture. On the other, a first-term congresswoman many still underestimated. It was David and Goliath all over again. Except this time, David wasn't holding a sling. She was holding her voice. The lawmaker who asked the question sat smugly, certain he had forced Crockett into one of two choices: bow in submission or lash out recklessly. Either way, he thought he would win. If she bowed, she looked weak. If she lashed out, she'd look disrespectful to RBG. But what he didn't account for was the third path. The path where Crockett could take the very weapon aimed at her and turn it into her sword. For a moment, it looked like she might hesitate. The camera zoomed closer, capturing her every blink, every twitch, every breath. Opponents were ready to pounce at the first sign of weakness. And yet she didn't look nervous. She looked calculating, calm, like a fighter who had seen this punch coming and was already winding up her counterstrike. The analyst leaned forward again, sensing it now. "Wait, watch her eyes. She's not cornered. She's plotting." The senior lawmaker cleared his throat as if to press his advantage. "Representative Crockett," he repeated, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Will you now admit, in light of Justice Ginsburg's wisdom, that your approach here today has been misguided? Every second stretched into eternity." On social media, millions would later pause at this exact frame, rewinding it again and again, the moment just before history bent. The trap was supposed to close shut. Instead, it was about to snap in the other direction, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to dodge. She was about to respond with something that would rip the smug smiles off their faces, ignite a storm on the internet, cement her name in headlines for weeks to come. What no one realized in that moment was that, by invoking Ruth Bader Ginsburg, they hadn't buried Jasmine Crockett. It handed her the match she needed to light the fire. And in just a few words, she was going to turn their entire plan into ash. The silence broke when Jasmine Crockett finally leaned forward. Her hands pressed firmly against the table, her eyes locked like laser beams on the lawmaker who had thrown the trap at her. For a second, she said nothing. The pause was deliberate. She let the weight of that silence choke the smugness out of the room. Cameras captured the flicker of unease that crossed her opponent's face. Just a flicker. But it was there. And then, with a calm, steady voice, Crockett began. "Justice Ginsburg taught us something powerful," she said. "She taught us that women don't know silence when injustice is loud. She taught us that strength doesn't come from bowing our heads. It comes from raising our voices when others would rather we sit down." The words cut through the chamber like a blade. Every head turned, every eye widened. This wasn't a defensive retreat. It was a counterattack. Crockett wasn't rejecting Ginsburg, she was claiming her. Wrapping herself in the very authority that had been used as a weapon against her. Her opponent tried to interrupt. But Crockett raised her hand and continued, her voice now rising with the rhythm of conviction. And let's be very clear, Justice. Ginsburg never told us to stop fighting. She never told us to stay quiet, while powerful men tried to lecture us about how we should behave. What she told us was to never forget our worth. And I promise you this. I know my worth. And I will not be lectured into silence, not today, not ever. Gasps rippled across the room. Us. Some lawmakers exchanged glances, suddenly realizing the trap had failed. Others sat frozen, stunned by the force of her words. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer, drinking in every syllable. The analyst whispered, almost breathless, "Oh my God, she's turning it around. She's owning RBG's words. This isn't defense, it's offense." Okay. And Crockett wasn't done. She leaned in closer, her tone sharp but precise, the kind of voice that carries far beyond four walls. "You ask me if I will admit I'm misguided. Let me ask you, are you so desperate that you have to dig up the voice of a woman who can't speak back, hoping her words will do your job for you?" Justice Ginsburg spoke truth to power. And today, I'm doing the same thing. The only difference is she isn't here to challenge you, but I am. The room erupted. Some clapped, some shouted objections. The senior lawmaker fumbled his smirk, vanishing, his hands tightening around his papers. He had expected a stumble. Instead, he was the one stumbling, unable to regain his footing. And then came the viral moment, the line that would be replayed endlessly online. The line that would light up Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube like wildfire. Crockett leaned back, tilted her head slightly, and delivered it with perfect timing. "If Justice Ginsburg were here today, I don't believe she'd tell me to sit down. I believe she'd tell you to listen." The chamber froze. That was it. That was the dagger. Within minutes, phones were out, clips were circulating, captions were slapped on. Crockett flips RBG's speech on its head. Jasmine Crockett destroys opposition with RBG's own legacy. This is how you clap back in Congress. The analyst shook his head, almost laughing in disbelief. They thought they buried her. Instead, they just gave her the biggest spotlight of her career. That's not just a reply. That's history being made. Across the country, screens lit up with Crockett's face. Cable news cut live to the exchange. Social media algorithms pushed the clip higher and higher. Her voice, her defiance, her confidence, it spread like fire in dry grass. For every critic who sneered, 1,000 new supporters rose, sharing her words, quoting her punchline, turning her reply into a rallying cry. And in that moment, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a comeback, it was a takeover. Jasmine Crockett had taken the ghost of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and turned it into her shield and sword. She hadn't run from history, she had stepped into it. The real explosion of this debate hit right here. That old Ruth Bader Ginsburg clip, the one where she spoke about the weakest cracks in American democracy, flashed back on the screen. Back then, it was just applause and chatter. But now replayed. Right in front of Jasmine Crockett, the entire room froze. This wasn't just an old tape. It was an attack, one designed to cut straight at Crockett's credibility. The camera zoomed in on Donald Trump. That same sly, confident grin was written across his face, the grin he always wears when he knows his opponent is cornered. Trump leaned forward slightly, folded his hands, and delivered just 5 words. See, even Ruth knew this. One line but behind it, an entire strategy. He had just handed his supporters a weapon. Crockett would either have to defend herself or watch the entire narrative crash down on her. And then, Jasmine Crockett did the unthinkable. She listened to the clip in silence, waited for the applause, and whispers to die, and then looked Trump dead in the eye. Her voice cut through the room. Judge Ginsburg spoke the truth about a broken system. But Mr. Trump, the real question is who broke it further? You call this a warning? I call this a mirror. The room erupted. A wave of shock ripped through the hall. For a few seconds, it was pin-drop silence. Then reporters scrambled over their keyboards. Twitter feeds lit up. One phrase instantly went viral. Crockett flips the script. But Trump wasn't done. He leaned back, that icy smile never leaving his face, and fired back. "Jasmine, when you talk about a broken mirror, remember you staring back at yourself." Nobody saw that coming. The punch landed hard. And just like that, this debate stopped being a debate, turned into a battlefield. Every sentence was now a bullet. Every comeback, a grenade. The audience wasn't just watching, they were living. The stakes weren't about points anymore, they're about survival. And here's the shocking part. This was only the beginning. What unfolded in the next few minutes would change the temperature of American politics overnight. By the time the debate reached its final stretch, the tension was unbearable. You could feel it in the air like the crackle before a lightning strike. Trump and Crockett were no longer just politicians trading words. It turned into warriors. Each sentence landing like a strike, each pause heavier than the last. Trump tried to frame the entire moment as proof of his foresight. He leaned into the microphone and said, "This is exactly why America needs strength, not weakness." Ginsburg knew it, and tonight, we all see it again. His supporters roared. The sound filled the hall like thunder. But Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she stood taller, calmer, almost defiant. With a steady voice she declared, "Strength isn't about shouting the loudest or rewriting history. It's about facing it, and if we keep playing this blame game, Mr. Trump, then the only legacy we'll leave behind is chaos." That line struck deep. The crowd gasped, cameras flashed, and suddenly the momentum began to shift. Crockett's words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a challenge. She had taken Ruth Bader Ginsburg's ghostly presence in the debate and turned it into a weapon of her own. And then came the moment that no one saw coming. Crockett looked directly at Trump and delivered the final blow. "You want to use Judge Ginsburg's words to corner me. But what you don't realize is this: her warning wasn't against people like me. It was against leaders like you." The silence that followed was deafening. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the hall erupted into chaos. Shows, shouts, reporters scrambling to capture every word. Twitter lit up like wildfire. Within minutes, hashtags exploded. Hashtag Crockett vs. Trump. Hashtag Ginsburg debate. #mere moment by the end of the night. One thing was crystal clear. This debate would go down in history. It wasn't just Trump versus Crockett. It was the ghost of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, her words haunting the stage, and her legacy reshaping the fight. And as the cameras faded to black, millions of viewers across America were left with the same burning thought: who really won tonight? Trump, with his sharp one-liners? Crockett with her fearless defiance? Or the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whose old speech had just sparked the fiercest clash of this political era? The answer didn't matter, because in that moment, history was made, and the shockwaves still being felt.